Hello everyone, welcome to APUSH Simplified. Today we're covering the most important information from period 1, so let's jump into it. We're going to start off by looking at pre-Columbus Native Americans. Thousands of years ago, before the last ice age, people traveled from Eastern Asia over the Bering Strait land bridge, and over the course of time they spread out all across the Americas. There are a wide variety of estimates as to how many there were before Columbus arrived, but a middle estimate is around 60 million. Keep in mind that number will be drastically reduced because of disease brought by European colonization. So jumping way ahead in time, immediately before the Spanish arrived, there were two great empires in the Americas. First were the Aztecs, located in parts of modern-day Mexico, and the other was the Incas, located on the western part of South America, along the Andes Mountains. Both empires had well-developed agricultural-based societies with large cities. The governments also demanded tribute from their subjects. Later, the Spanish will supplant these tribute systems with their own encomienda system. In North and Central America, maize, or corn cultivation, was widespread, along with squash and beans. These are known together as the Three Sisters. So north of the Aztecs and Incas, in what would become the US and Canada, there were no highly organized empires like the Aztecs or Inca. The most developed civilizations were around the Mississippi Valley. Maize cultivation was widespread. In this area, we see great mound builders, and there were cities, one of the largest ones being Cahokia. However, all of this was abandoned perhaps a few hundred years before European colonization. Further east of the Mississippi area, there were at the time of European colonization two large groups of people, the Algonquin and Iroquois. So we know a lot about these groups. These were not empires though, but dozens of distinct societies that shared a common language and lifestyle. In general, the peoples in this area were settled and practiced slash and burn agriculture. As far as gender roles, women tended the crops, gathered plants, and oversaw community affairs, while men did the hunting, fishing, and warfare. There were a few large confederacies like the Powhatan, who we will come back to in period 2, and the Iroquois. This was not an empire, though, and there were many smaller chiefdoms within the Confederacy. And sometimes chieftains within the Confederacy warred against each other. One interesting note is that the Iroquois were a matriarchal society, in which power was inherited through female lines. Okay, moving on to other regions. The Great Lakes region was dominated by the Ottawas, Ojibwas, and Potawatomis. These three groups also thought of themselves as a single people, the Anishinaabe. However, there were many subgroups and chiefdoms. In general, they were semi-nomadic, with areas of hunting and fishing across the region. Next, the Great Plains and Rockies regions were transformed by the arrival of the horse. Horses were brought over by the Spanish, and some had gotten away and bred in the wild. Before the Plain tribes had even met the Spanish, they were able to tame these horses and quickly became central to many tribes' identities. A couple of great nomadic empires developed, the Comanche and the Sioux. And I wish I could spend a lot more time on these groups in this area because the history is fascinating and also incredibly violent. But this is APUSH. We have to move on. Next up is the arid Southwest. Through ingenuity, the Native Americans were able to cultivate maize, even in the dry climate. They also built dwellings out of clay. There are some well-preserved examples of this throughout the Southwest. The Anasazi and the Hopi are a few of the tribes that inhabited the area. The Spanish called them pueblos, which means townspeople. Lastly, the Pacific Coast. Mostly there were hunter-gatherers in this region, in which dozens of small localized groups inhabited the area. Some nurtured strong warrior traditions like the Chinooks, and developed sophisticated fishing techniques. Briefly, let's touch on trade and religion. Before the Spanish arrived, there were expansive trade networks across the Americas. Goods from one region could be found hundreds to even thousands of miles away. This mutual trade helped tie regions together. On the religious front, keep in mind we have to extremely generalize about literally hundreds of different groups of peoples. But in general, most Native Americans can be best described as animists who believed that the natural world had spiritual power all around. Some believed in a great overarching spirit, some believed in an afterlife. But if you want more depth, you really need to look more closely at individual tribes. Now we're going to shift our focus to Western Europe. In the mid-1300s, the plague or Black Death devastated the population of the area. In the following decades, a rebirth or renaissance occurred. Since the fall of the Western Roman Empire centuries before, Europe had been in a state of feudalism with a very hierarchical society. In general, monarchs at the top, the nobles and knights, and the vast majority of the population were peasants, sometimes tied to the land in a state of serfdom. For a large amount of the Middle Ages, peasants were more tied to their lord or manor than any particular king or state. However, leading up to the time of Columbus, monarchs had begun to assert more control over their nobles and develop a nation-state. And this is important for exploration because nation-states can more easily garner the resources necessary for exploration. As you could probably guess, Europe was a very patriarchal society. Property and social identity descended in male family lines. Men also controlled most aspects of their children and wives' lives. Also, in many parts of Europe, primogeniture was the norm in custom and law, which meant the eldest son inherited most or all of their father's land. This resulted in the younger children possibly being landless and poor. In general, most Europeans were peasants, which entailed a poor farming lifestyle that for many people was short and difficult. We need to spend a minute talking about a very important subject in Western Europe, and that is Christianity. The Roman Catholic Church was extremely powerful and influential. However, long-running gripes like the sale of indulgences, along with corrupt popes and local Catholic officials like bishops and priests, created cracks in the foundation of the institution. Martin Luther, a German monk, wrote down the many issues with the Catholic Church in his 95 Theses. This sparked a lot of discussion and debate within the church and amongst its adherents. Another man, a Swiss named John Calvin, came out with his own interpretations of Christianity, including that of predestination, which meant that God had already ordained who would be saved and who would not. Calvin developed quite a following. His ideas would spread to England, where the Puritans adapted them. This protest or Protestant movement swept across several European nations, including England, in which King Henry VIII formally broke his country off from the Catholic Church. Overall, this sets up a lot of European conflict between Protestants and Catholics, and it also leads to competition in converting and spreading their versions of Christianity. The last region we're going to look at is West and Central Africa. In this area, several major empires rose and fell in the previous centuries, including the Ghana, Mali, and Songhai empires. These empires sought to control the lucrative trans-Saharan trade that linked to the Middle East. Common trade items were gold, copper, salt, and slaves. By the mid-15th century, Europeans, especially the Portuguese, were able to open up coastal trade routes with the Western African nations and tribes. Speaking of trade and the Portuguese, we are now at the point of looking at exploration and conquest. Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal founded a center for navigation that focused on how to make long-distance voyage safer. Their experts designed a new type of ship, the caravel, that featured a triangular sail that enabled the ship to go against the wind. The Portuguese began making ventures to the West African coast for trade. Following in the Portuguese footsteps were Italian merchants whose valuable trade in Asian goods had been cut off because of the recent Ottoman taking of Constantinople, ending the venerable Byzantine Empire. At first, Europeans were more interested in gold and other commodities, but they found ways to exploit the slave trade as well. Now looking at Portugal's Iberian neighbor, Spain. Recently, Spain had completed the Reconquista, which was a long effort to expel Muslim nations from the peninsula. Spain was actually made up of several kingdoms. However, they unified under King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella, creating a new and powerful nation. Immediately, they sought trade and an empire. An Italian merchant, Christopher Columbus, petitioned the monarchs many times to help fund an ambitious voyage to Asia across the Atlantic. Columbus miscalculated the actual distance to Asia, and for him, it was a good thing the Americas were in between. So after convincing the monarchs and lining up a few investors, Columbus was able to gather 3 ships and sail for 6 weeks, crossed 3,000 miles of ocean, and landed in the Bahamas. The first island Columbus and his men landed on, they christened San Salvador. Columbus thought he had arrived in Asia and incorrectly called the natives Indians. Columbus was surprised by what he saw as he deemed it the childlike nature of the Tano, who were the local tribe on the islands Columbus landed on. In short order, Columbus claimed the islands for Spain and demanded tribute from the natives. This was the beginning of centuries of a long, horrific treatment of Native Americans by Europeans. Columbus desperately needed to find something of value to bring back to Spain, as the expedition cost a lot of money. Plus, he needed new reasons for more ventures to the Americas. His men found very little gold or silver, and since he was not actually in Asia, there was no possibility of silk or spices. However, the Spanish monarchs were still interested. Following Columbus were the Spanish conquistadors who made aggressive incursions onto the mainland. Side note, both of these stories are incredible, and if you get the chance, you should do some more research into them. The first major expedition of conquest was Cortez. His 600 men, along with key Native American allies, defeated Montezuma, the leader of the Aztecs. The Aztec Empire was massive, with its largest city greater than anything in Western Europe. In South America, Pizarro and his few hundred Spanish were able to defeat the Inca Empire. Spanish steel and, very importantly, European disease decimated Native American populations, especially smallpox. Over the next several hundred years, European diseases would kill over 90% of Native Americans. However, Spanish and European cruelty played a role as well. The Portuguese took Brazil, and before a war of empires could break out between the Iberian nations, the Catholic Church stepped in and negotiated the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the New World between Spain and Portugal. Back in the Spanish colonies, the conquistadors capitalized on pre-existing systems of tribute from the Incan and Aztec empires to implement their own system of tribute called the encomienda system. The crown gave conquistadors large swaths of land to claim tribute in labor and goods from Native American communities. The Spanish officials also co-opted the Inca Mita system, which made native laborers available for forced work in the silver mines. Possibly the most important primary source from Period 1 is Bartolomé de las Casas' History of the Indies. Las Casas was originally a Spanish settler in the New World. However, he turned to a career in the Catholic Church as a priest and later bishop. Over several decades, Las Casas wrote his History of the Indies, part of which he heavily criticized the Spanish treatment of Native Americans. Las Casas was somewhat successful in new laws being passed. However, the native population plunged from disease and mistreatment. and the Spanish will turn to African labor and slavery to replace the Native Americans. I previously made a whole video that covers this primary source in more detail. I highly recommend it as this source shows up often on AP questions. Next, we need to cover a very important development, and that is the Columbian Exchange, which is the widespread transfer of plants, animals, culture, human populations, technology, diseases, and ideas between the Americas, West Africa, and Europe between the 15th and 16th centuries. Now, that definition covers a lot of territory, but there are some specific areas of focus on AP tests, including along with the different peoples came diseases and livestock like the horse to the New World, and in the reverse direction, crops like corn and potatoes are introduced to the Old World that results in greater crop yields and population growth. Now, to focus a bit on two topics of demographics and religion, hundreds of thousands of Spanish and Africans came to the New World. Unlike the later British colonies, racial mixing was widespread in the Spanish colonies. A system of complex racial categories developed, and a legal code based on a casta system differentiated the groups. If you were a Spanish-born individual, you were on the top, and if you were full-blood African or Native American, you were on the bottom, and were probably in some sort of state of servitude. And if you were Spanish but born in the New World, or mixed race, you were somewhere in the middle. When it came to religion in the Spanish colonies, the local indigenous beliefs were suppressed, and natives were converted voluntarily and involuntarily to Catholic Christianity. However, native beliefs had some influence on Christianity at the local level. Colonization and exploitation of the Americas led to Spain becoming the wealthiest nation in Europe, and they tried to use that wealth to stamp out the Protestant Reformation. Spain would be unsuccessful in doing so and would waste a lot of treasure. The English became a thorn in Spain's side, as state-sponsored English pirates like Francis Drake harassed Spanish shipping. Spain sent an invasion armada to England. However, a fierce storm of English ships destroyed the Spanish fleet. This was a huge blow to Spain, and it opened up colonization opportunities for European countries. Spain would continue spending treasure in European wars, but rivals, specifically England, grew more powerful. England's economy began to boom with its government-supported textile industry, which had a virtual monopoly on the international textile trade. England's government focused on reducing imports and increasing exports. This state-supported economic system is called mercantilism, and we will come back to that in period 2. So to wrap up, I want to quickly discuss the common primary sources and topics for AP questions from this time period. This time period has the least amount of common primary sources, with the Journals of Columbus and the History of the Indies by Bartolomé de las Casas being very important. The common topics are how geography and climate influenced pre-Columbus native societies, including the importance of maize cultivation, the Spanish goals of exploration and conquest, including gaining wealth, increasing their nation's power, and spreading Christianity, the encomienda system, and finally, the Columbian Exchange, both the positive and negative impacts. Okay, that does it for the Period 1 review. Please give the video a like, subscribe to the channel for more APUSH Simplified content, and share with your students or peers to help them out as well.